So it's a great opportunity to speak with Mike and Paul and Mitch. I was lucky enough to sit on Paul's board for a number of years, so I probably know his business best, but I know a little bit about the other guys as well. So one of the things that I did last night, Paul, was I reread sort of the old investment memorandum that I actually wrote when we invested in your business. And one of the things that was interesting that I reread in that was we had this section where we talk about risks and what it is. And we had this, we identified the risks in Seek, and this was 97, 98, something like this. And we had two brothers. We had a best friend whose dad was the chairman, and a first-time CEO. But you were a first-time CEO, weren't you? And Mike, you're a first-time CEO, yeah? And how about Mitch?
Yep.
So here we got 3 first-time CEOs, and we all hear this rumor, let's invest in serial CEOs. Yeah, well, here we are. Okay. So I did this quick back-of-the-envelope calculation, and pretended to put $1 million into Paul's company, which we did. Pretended we put $1 million into Mike's company, which we tried to do, and he didn't let us. And then we pretended to put $1 million into Mitch's company, and he wouldn't let us either. But so we said, right, if we each had put $1 million into their businesses, where would that $1 million be today? So Paul's company roughly carries a $2.5 billion valuation. Mike's is rumored to be somewhere above the B, and somewhere Mitch's is rumored to be somewhere in the H. Yeah. So if we did all that and we held all of that and we invested $3 million, where would we be in terms of how much money would we have made today? Anybody got a guess? $180 million. 60x return. That's pretty darn good in any market. So I think the message is, and all these guys have businesses where? Here in Australia. So you can build a very, very large set of businesses from Australia. So one of the things I wanted to ask all of you, since all of you were first-time CEOs, was what do you think what was your biggest challenge as a first-time CEO, and how long did it actually take you to become a CEO? Did you think you were one to begin with, and how long did it actually take you to become one before you realized you actually were one?
Me first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Case of age before beauty, I suspect. Look, I think it probably took 5+ years to sort of get comfortable with the job, and there was a lot of learning on the job. I mean, for me, I'd come out, and fairly atypical background, I guess, for a founder of an internet company. I was a lawyer, and I had never managed people before. I'd sort of worked on a range of transactions. I'd worked under a lot of pressure, worked on large matters with a whole bunch of really interesting entrepreneurial type people. But for me, it was the first time I've ever managed people before. It was the first time I'd worked in a technology environment before. So it was an enormous learning curve. And I guess you learn along the way. I think for me, the most important learning was probably around evenness and just kind of being very focused, but also I don't think that, anyone who sets up a business is always going to be really, really focused. So it's generally not an issue or a challenge, but I think it's just evenness and kind of just sort of rolling with the punches. And you have good days, you have good weeks, you have good months, but you also have bad days and weeks and months and years. And I think really just kind of keeping that focus and that vision is like, this is what we're about. And people in the business are looking at you and kind of being aware that, there's a on the one hand, you want to keep a bit of a game face and kind of like, not like, oh, this is hard, we're running out of money in a couple of months, it's too hard. On the other hand, if you kind of sort of don't tell people as it is, people pretty quickly pick up that there's a whole lot of bullshit going on. Sure. I think that's finding that balance between, on the one hand, being really open and honest with people, and on the other hand, apologies. I won't go back and say all that again if it hasn't been working. I reckon the guys in the front couple of rows got it, but sorry for the rest of you back there. And I think it's just keeping that evenness.
Well, Mike, I know that I've heard you talk about this a little bit before, but at Atlassian, you guys tried to establish a culture very early on that was really important. How important was it to establish the culture? And Mitch, I know you do the same thing, but for all of you, how important is that culture setting early on, and does that sort of carry on? Is the culture that you set in the early days, does that continue throughout the business and allow you to scale a little bit?
I don't know. I don't know. You set the culture. I think culture just follows you, right?
But it's set by you guys as
It's
examples.
your actions. It's the way that us, as the two of us as founders, and then the early team interoperated as kind of the culture that we set.
Yep.
It wasn't a conscious thing, right? We operated in the way we wanted to operate, and then we certainly talk about shepherding that. So certainly the values of the company and things like that that we've tried to record. But I think it's important to note, and we talk about this internally a lot, that culture shifts. It's the group of people internally, right? And we have a much more diverse, broad culture than we did, when we had 6, 7 people. It was 7 guys, sub 25, go out drinking pretty hard, write code all day. It was a very different culture than what we have today. Yeah. But that's not a bad thing necessarily. I mean, we have a lot of subcultures overlaid with hopefully a set of shared values that everybody in the company has.
What about you, Mitch? I mean, you and Eddie have... what's your sort of take on this?
Yeah, very, very similar to what Mike said, where I guess for us the culture is defined by the people you bring in and how you empower them.
Yep.
So we really wanted to have an autonomous culture where I guess our underlying rule, and it still holds today, is would we go out for a drink, a beer, a cocktail, a soft drink with that person? And if we wouldn't, then we don't hire them or we fire them. Right. It's a very simplistic view, but that's generally what we look at. Right. So we tend to find that, and we've done it many times, if we bring someone who's a bad cultural influence into the company, it spreads like a disease throughout the company. And then by the time we hear about it, 10, 15, 20 people have been impacted from that one bad hiring decision. So we really tried early on to make sure that we brought in the best people, and we didn't always do it. Very similar to Mike. We had 10, 15 engineers, we'd code 20 hours a day, and that's just what it was. But as we grew, now we're almost 200 people, the culture's changed, and there is a different culture in Sydney and Austin, but it's not necessarily good or bad. I think our culture's improved over time.
So do each of you guys remember when the first day you sort of walked into the office and you go, holy mackerel, I don't know that guy's name? Because, for the first sort of 30, 40, you kind of know everybody, and then you get to this point and you go, hi.
Absolutely.
What did that tell you?
I remember the exact day for me. I mean, we started in November '97, and we IPO'd in April 2005, and so it was about a sort of a 7.5-year period we'd been going before we IPO'd, and we probably had about 200 staff at that point, and at that point I knew everyone in the business. I knew their name, I knew what they did, probably in just about every case I knew where they'd come from, and I think I'd interviewed basically every person before they came into the organisation. So a lot of my time was spent on hiring. And then we were away for about 3-4 weeks on the IPO roadshow, and that was a period of a fair bit of growth in the business in terms of number of people coming in. And then I sort of came back from the IPO roadshow, and there was like a whole lot of people that I just didn't know their name. Which was kind of cool, it was fine. But one of the things I realised is when someone starts and you don't get to meet them when they start and you don't find out their name and their story and stuff, it actually gets really hard from there. It's actually hard to subsequently meet people and absorb who they are and what they're doing. And so that was, to some extent, that was just symptomatic of the fact the organisation had grown a lot. And unlike these guys, we basically had one head office. We were pretty much all in Melbourne, other than relatively, as you know, Bill, relatively small sales teams in Sydney and Brisbane and Perth and Adelaide and Auckland, etc. at that point. And what that really, I think, reinforces is as the organisation gets to that size, you really need to embed those things around great processes with hiring, real focus on values to the point that Mike talked about earlier, because unless those things are embedded as the organisation grows, it kind of, I think having really, really diverse people with all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of different attitudes, all sorts of world experience is really, really important. Yeah. But the thing for us that was really important was the focus on the values. Right. And Mitch talked about kind of going for a drink with someone. We kind of had a bit of a no dickhead policy. So our attitude is that, if we thought
same thing.
Yeah, exactly.
We call it the alley duck policy. If you see somebody walking down the street and you say, oh, there's my business partner, and I have a choice to go have a beer or duck in the alley so he doesn't see me.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, exactly. So Mike, how did when you and Scott sort of got to that point, how did you figure out how to scale yourselves? Because your business is growing, but your influence is waning. How do you keep your influence there when your business gets to that point?
Yeah, look, scaling the founders is something we've been trying to do for years. We've yet to invent the cloning machine. Tried. Look, it's hard. I mean, the values is the first step we took to really scale, and you know, the exercise we took to come up with our values, and I say come up with in a very loose sense, is we took two groups, some group of managers and a group of employees. I think we had about 30, 40 people at the time, and we basically codified the things that we never wanted to lose about the business we had today, rather than trying to invent we want to have integrity and honesty or some crap that we didn't have. Not that we didn't have those things. But, you know, I think a lot of people try to write value statements in a vacuum, like, oh, we aspire to be like these things. And we said, no, we want to do the opposite way around. We wrote down, and that was sort of the first thing we did to try to scale the founders. And obviously we were heavily involved in that process. And it was great that there was sort of 85% overlap between the two.
Yeah.
You know, then we went to lunch with every new employee, and that scaled for a little while until just having lunch every day. And then... you know, you start with 2 people, 3 people, 4 people.
Put on a lot of weight that way.
Yeah, that's right. You go to San Francisco and you have 5 days of 4-person lunches, and you're like, all right, this isn't working anymore. And you know, now we have sessions, so I take new employees about 6 to 10 at a time, and have a sort of 3-hour session where they can ask any question under the sun. It's a very small, intimate gathering, and you know, it's a really good. And we tell them to ask the hardest questions they can, and pretend like they're the CEO and all this sort of stuff. And you know, it gives you a little face time with them, and etc. And that's scaled to the point that we are now. I mean, we're hiring 3-4 people a week, and we can scale with that process, right? But that will eventually run out of space, and we'll have to find some other way to do it. Other than that, I would say lastly is just communications. Right?
Yeah.
We both founders have traditionally been bad at over communicating, and the old adage that you can never communicate too much. We've tried to put in place a series of communication events, from founder updates, which are supposed to go out weekly but tend to be more every 2 or 3 weeks, to, you know, all hands we have once a month in Sydney and San Francisco, and via VC to Amsterdam and other offices. So, you know, just evolving those communication processes as the need happens is what we've done so far.
Yeah, great. And so, Mitch, you're sort of at this point now where, you know, you guys are getting big enough so that, you know, you're having to put some management in place, and you got your office in Austin. So how do you, so for Mitch first, but all of you guys, how do you, what happens, you know, for the audience when they get to the point where the business gets large enough, but you want to keep that sense of urgency, and you want to keep that entrepreneurial ecosystem sort of going inside a large organization? What do you do there? How do you make sure that happens so that you don't become this large, lethargic, oh, I don't want to be like that guy, and you are, all of a sudden you are?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that came from Ed and I was having a big enough vision. So we want to be the leader in the space, and we're doing everything towards that. The second is bringing in entrepreneurial executives to run each department. So not the guys that come from the big companies like the IBMs or the HPs, but the guys that have had startups or had exits in fast-growing companies previously.
Right.
And really building out their MBOs and KPIs to reflect where we'd like the business to go in line with what they believe about the business as well.
Yeah.
And so far that's worked pretty well.
Yeah. The same for you guys? I mean, how do you keep that sense of urgency growing in a large organization?
It's interesting. A lot of what Mike said is like, and it's amazing, there's so much in common in terms of what is done within Atlassian with some of the things that we did in terms of Seek around the values and around communication, around the all staff and stuff. So it's really interesting, a whole lot of different sort of processes to really work on that stuff. We found there were different points in time where you kind of, as an organisation, you kind of start to feel the pressures a bit, and you actually have to consciously change the way in which you do stuff. So for us, it was probably one of the points was around we got to about 80, 100 people. And that's an interesting size of an organisation, because that's probably a size of an organisation where you do need to add in a little bit more functional expertise. Suddenly you need probably a stronger capability in terms of HR and in terms of finance and a whole bunch of other areas, but you don't want to smother that with process and stuff like that. So it was partly, I think, the leaders within the business consciously changing their approach and kind of stepping back a little bit and kind of understanding that we need to, the organisation, and there was a great quote that Bill Gates once made where people sort of asked him about his policy or process of delegation in the early years of Microsoft. And he said, you know, there was a time at Microsoft when there wasn't a single line of code that went out without being checked by me. And he sort of said, we realised that wasn't very scalable.
Right.
And so if he hadn't have been using him, obviously as a foremost example of someone like him hadn't have been able to transform himself, the organisation would have never grown. So I think firstly for the leadership team, it's really important that they actually evolve their style and processes and way of doing things. And I think secondly, it's around continually bringing in people who have the ability to grow, have that nice mix of informal style, very open culture, but also have the sort of the track record and the expertise to take a business from here to here.
Yeah.
And then it is around kind of putting in place processes that actually don't slow you down. They actually enable you to do things faster. They enable you to do things in a much smarter way. And some of those processes, a lot of those processes around people, is around recruiting and around HR and around performance management and around management of the values and integration of the values to make sure there's really it's not just values of something up on a wall. It's really about how the organisation behaves on a day-to-day basis.
So one of the things you said I want to pick up on that is that for each of you guys, I know you used to do this a little bit. I'm sure the other guys do it too, but I'd be interested in the views. So, each of you sort of starts off as an entrepreneur, and you're either offering a product or a service, and you're very, very involved in that product or service, making sure every T is crossed, the I is dotted, and you deliver the best you can. Then the organization sort of gets bigger, and you have other responsibilities, people management, all this other stuff. So when you get to the point where you are, really a business, how do you manage this sort of making sure? The question is, how deep do you dive into the product service details now versus how deep you did then? How much do you delegate to your people? Because you obviously want the product to go out and be awesome, but at the same time you have other things you have to do. So how do you balance that? What's the mix there? Do you product check everything that goes out the door? How does it work for you, Mike?
I was hoping you would throw that to me first. Yeah, look, we have two very detail-oriented founders, so we probably product check far too much even now. If there's any Atlassians in the audience, I don't know.
There's one over there.
Yeah, we're incredibly involved. I mean, it probably depends on your model. I can't really give you a generic answer, right? We're a product company through and through. We live and die on the quality of what we put out.
Yeah.
We don't have a model. Sadly, we don't have some sort of monopoly.
Monopolies are good.
Strong market share.
Strong market share, is it? All right, sorry. There is still a classifieds business in the newspapers. It's just smaller than it was.
Yes.
Look, it's hard. I mean, we're a product business, right? So for us as co-CEOs, it's the day that we don't care about the product is the day that the business is probably in a big trouble.
Right.
And so, you try to delegate as much of the process and other things to other people and bring on, senior business operatives, but you can never delegate it all.
Right.
And so you have to let go of some of the product reins and try to bring on some smart product people, and that's hard too. And then just have good dialogues and good discussions with them, right? And we're still intimately involved in the product decisions, and you sort of move more from a pixel pushing level up to a strategic product direction level, I guess,
Right.
and there's some spectrum in between. But I think it's important. I always describe the building of the company as it's like we've just stacked layers on a building,
Right.
And we've done every job on the way up, and we're the only people in the building that's ridden the elevator from the bottom to the top, right?
Yep.
And we can ride it back down to almost any level, right? And engineers think it's crazy when we participate in, our sort of shipper days and all that sort of stuff, and they sit down and like, you write code? And dude, what do you think I did for the first 4 years, right? But, it's useful for us to keep in touch at that level and be able to understand that stuff. But do we write any code that ships out today on a regular basis? No.
Yeah. How about you, Mitch? I mean, you still write code, don't you?
No.
Oh, you
I
don't?
haven't written code for a long time.
All right, okay.
The mess that I created at the beginning is still being cleaned up. I love going deep because I'm a product guy.
Yeah.
So every day I'm sitting with, not every day, twice a week, sitting with our product team, our engineering team, or part of them. And I guess what I like to do is share a bit about the vision for the product, make sure they have a really good roadmap that is fluid, but then also get with them as they're iterating. So as they're wireframing, as they're going through the UX experience, share the feedback, take what they're doing and get it throughout the rest of the company so that anyone can come up and suggest a change or an idea.
Right.
And that's a process we're putting in place now where we don't want to give engineers leverage over product or vice versa. We want to make sure that anyone in the company has a say in the way the product is built to a certain extent. So I don't go deep anymore,
Right.
Especially not on the engineering side. I think we've got a really good engineering team. My passion has always been building usable products, not so much coding them. So I still love to go deep with the guys. I was wireframing last week in Balsamic, just because I had a quick idea and wanted to fire it off. But more and more I'm kind of staying higher level.
Yeah. You can tell Paul and I smiled because we thought you were talking about salad oil.
Balsamic, bit of olive oil.
If I could just, I see you're about to move on. If I go back to the previous question,
Yeah.
I think I have an interesting anecdote. So I was at, I spent a lot of time at Facebook. Luckily, we share a co-investor, and they're just an amazing firm, inside and out. I mean, enough been written about it from the outside, but from the inside, just phenomenal firm. And one of the guys who was early there and early at Google and had sort of was on his second big wave, and I think he'd done some things beforehand. I can't just remember his history, but I asked him the question you asked about scale and all those sorts of things, and he said one of the things that he had been fascinated at Google, and he'd written it through, I don't know, probably 30 to, I don't know, a few thousand, many thousands, was that Google always aspired, and the founders always aspired to be the best company, the most efficient company, process-wise, scale-wise, of their size at each phase.
Right.
So there's a certain inevitability to scale that if you're a 5-person, 100-person company, you've got a lot of issues that you don't have in a 50-person company. And similarly, if you're a 5,000-person company, you've got a lot of issues you don't have 500. And their goal was basically to be the best damn 500-person company in the world that felt, 500-person company that felt like a 50-person company.
Yeah.
And a 5,000-person that felt like a 500. So there's a certain inevitability that I see entrepreneurs trying to fight with scale, and big companies are evil and all this. And I'm not sure that's the case. And it's almost like you want to. Big companies have amazing processes and are super efficient animals if they're successful.
Yeah.
But they lose all the small company feel and the ability to make change. In small companies, anyone can make changes, but you don't have process, everyone's doing tons of work. And so you effectively want to be the smallest feeling big company you can.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's evident, because if you take a look at the revenues of Google or in the revenues of Facebook, for instance, and you divide the number of employees into it, you'll find that the revenue per employee is really high, and that's because they're super efficient. Yeah. Cool. So one of the things that each of you sort of, I was thinking about this the other night, and each of you sort of did something that was unique in a lot of ways. So Paul, for you, you sort of, you decided to have this large market share, and
Good decision.
Yeah, good decision. And I know for those who don't know, I mean, you guys are number 1, number 2 in China, number 1 in Mexico.
Number 1 in Mexico, number 1 in Brazil, and number 1 in most markets now through Southeast Asia.
Yeah, but so I'd like each of you to sort of talk about a decision early on that you made. I know you guys broke the enterprise sales, sort of model, Mike, and I know a few things you did too, Mitch, but you had a two-sided market issue when you first began, which a lot of these guys out here have, which is, I got to put some jobs up and I got to have some. So how did you, what's one of those decisions that you made early on that made a difference in your business, and that still, if you hadn't made that decision early on, you wouldn't be as successful as you were today?
I think there were 2 or 3 things for us, and I think people sort of ask us, what about what did you do right, what did you do wrong? And the reality is we did a lot more wrong than we did right. It's just the stuff we did right were probably the really important stuff.
Right.
And the most important thing I think is we actually understood from day one, which was there is a marketplace here, and someone's going to win that marketplace, and there is a really good opportunity for us to be a dominant player in that marketplace. And it's there's no point, you can talk about monetizing all you like and having high margins and high market share and all that sort of stuff and all the great things that come with a strong marketplace, but they're outputs. And the inputs were, 5 or 6 or 7 years of just being super aggressive, super focused. As you know, we had a lot of support from our shareholders and our board and the team at Seek, because there are times where we easily could have lost, kind of lost a little bit of confidence. You're losing $1 million a month and you don't have that much money in the bank, and it's post.com era and all that sort of stuff. And so I think understanding there was going to be one winner, and it was really about kind of just driving those key metrics on both the job seeker side and the employer recruitment firm side. And we understood that this is a virtuous cycle. The more jobs you've got means the greater number of job seekers you attract. The greater number of job seekers you've got, the more employers and recruitment firms advertise. You get a virtuous cycle. The problem is you start on day one with no job seekers and no advertisers. And so that's a really, really hard challenge. But what made it a bit easier was it was 1998, and no one else had much in the way of job seekers and advertisers. So you're starting in a vacuum as opposed to starting against incumbents.
Right.
And so what we tried to do, like on the advertiser side, Matt Rockman, as you know, did a fantastic job driving the sales side of the business for the first 7 or 8 years as one of the founders. And Simon Rosenberg, somewhere here, who's still with the business and has been with Seek 11 or 12 years now, who was very intimately involved with that. And you'd go to a client and you'd find people in a space that are early adopters. Firstly, we'd focus much more on the recruitment firms rather than the corporates, because they were the wholesale providers. They were the guys who could provide us with the large numbers, and it was really about building the metrics out as quickly as we possibly could. And you find people are early adopters. There's no point sort of beating your head against a wall in relation to a guy who's not an early adopter and trying to convince them to do something that they're not ready for. So identify the guys who are the early adopters, and again, not trying to sell as competitive to print. It was very much selling at that point as supplementary to print. You're spending $100,000 a year on your print advertising. All we want you to do is spend maybe $200 a month with us, and you can put all your job ads up and Seek, and you can go to your clients, the end businesses who are looking for staff, and saying, we're going the extra mile. Not only are we doing the things that everyone else is doing, but we're actually going the extra mile, and we're using this new medium called the internet, where there's a whole lot of smart young people using it, and we're attracting this pool of smart young candidates. And then you get your early adopter, and he says, great, he or she says, great, fantastic, I'll do this, and all that sort of stuff. Then, of course, what you do is you go to that guy's competitor, and you say, your competitor's doing this, you don't want to be left behind.
Right.
And kind of just build it brick by brick.
Yeah.
On the job seeker side, and Andrew is very much driving, as you know, the distribution side of things and that sort of strategy. And for us, it was about distribution. We didn't have a lot of money, and we did a deal with 9MSN back in within a month of the site going live in March '98 to provide us with distribution, and we paid them $7,500 a month. And that was regarded as absolutely radical. That, like, before then, in this country anyway, the whole concept was that you provide content, they provide distribution, and you have barter deals. And people told us we were complete and utter idiots paying for distribution, and you're mad, and $7,500 a month, and what are you getting for that? And traffic should be free. Reality is that decision was probably worth several $100 million of value to us.
Yeah.
So that was like a really good investment, $7,500 a month. And there was a big value shift in the same way, and we'd seen this, and through my involvement as acting as a lawyer for LookSmart back a few years earlier, we'd seen the value shift from Netscape. Has anyone ever heard of Netscape before?
Yeah.
You're dating yourselves. We saw
Colour, black and white TV.
Exactly. we saw the value shift from Netscape to the likes of Yahoo, Lycos, InfoSeek, Intomi, etc., all the guys who are the dominant search players around then, Alta Vista. And this was a similar thing we tried to emulate.
Right.
And the 9MSN guys sort of worked it out and said, we're going to provide you with distribution. We want 20 or 30% of your equity. Anyway, we managed to duck and weave for long enough and avoided issuing the equity to them. But, it was a really important value shift for us.
Yeah, and Mike, people, I remember when you guys first started, selling your stuff the way you did, people thought you were crazy too. So tell us about that. Tell us about that.
You told us you were way too cheap?
In a good way.
In a good way, way too cheap. Look, it's hard to come down to individual pivotal decisions, right? Obviously our model's very different, and we evolved it very rapidly into a model that we stuck with for a while, that we made the right hunches in the long term. I think from a business perspective, though, obviously we've made good acquisitions and built good products and all that sort of thing. I think one of the pivotal things we did as a business is realise it's probably two things. One is when we started our second product, we really shifted from being a single product company, which probably would have been acquired well long ago as a bolt-on to someone else's business, and had to solve the challenges of being a product company in a generic sense, right? With a generic, how do we build product, grow it, nurture it, increase its market share, market it, all those sorts of things. So we have a very generic skill set internally, if you look across the business, at building and marketing products, generic products. We have target markets and all that, but that was a big shift for us that has probably been very successful looking back on it as we've grown out our product set to be able to grow all sorts of products. And that was probably the first big decision that we made. I don't honestly know how conscious it was looking back. It was probably less conscious than it should have been, but it was a very good decision, and we didn't want to get acquired quickly. We were building for the long term, right? The second probably key thing we did, and I was just talking to someone during the break, apologies for forgetting the name, but was very early we realised that scaling was going to be extremely difficult, right?
Yeah.
And Scaling for us was not our model. Like, our model scales beautifully. It's just an amazing, wonderful, recurring revenue stream that just keeps pouring in, right? The CFO thinks it's nuts. Days outstanding of 0, and, we can empty the bank account tomorrow and pay everybody next week. Like, it just doesn't stack up from a financial point of view from what people have historically seen in the enterprise software world. But what doesn't scale is the people aspects, the support aspects, etc. And that's what we've had to work extremely hard on. And that's where you really have to take a punt in our model. We didn't have a nice, like, someone's going to win this,
Right.
we've just got to win it, right? Which in some ways is scary. Building a marketplace is really hard, but at least you knew the outcome was you were going to be victorious, right? We don't live in a market where there's going to be one victor ever, I think. But we kind of realised that scaling the business was going to be largely people related.
Right.
And culture and values and some things are good, but we have to forward invest. And even now we're forward investing hugely in scaling the business, which basically is betting on yourself, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to find somewhere near 500 engineers in the next 3 years, right? And it's staggering to me to think, Christ, how the hell are we going to find that many people? But when you start thinking about that, and we've always scaled the business, okay, we've got to find 10 engineers, right? Well, if we just interview them one at once and we do this, it's not going to scale. We need a new process, right? Now we need 100. So now we're thinking, okay, we need 500 engineers. We've always forward investing in scaling the business parts because we believed in the model and the products underneath, which a lot of entrepreneurs I don't see. They're like, oh yeah, I'll hire those guys when I get the cash or the funding or whatever, and it's like, it's going to get too late, right? You run into trouble that way.
One of the just on that theme, and one of the other things that we talked about a lot, and I think was a real, and again, I think it's actually really resonated a lot with me, Mike's comment that some of the most important decisions you make, you actually don't realise at the time are as important as they are. You realise they're pretty important, but then you look back a few years later and say, wow, that was a really pivotal decision, but you don't have quite that context at the time. The other thing that we used to think about a lot when we hired people, and I think, Bill, you were part of these conversations pretty early on around the board table, is that the concept of scaling people isn't just around numbers and making sure that you've kind of got the capability ahead of the demand. It's also when you hire an individual, you're saying, am I hiring this person because she meets the needs of the business today, or because I think she's got the ability to scale and meet the needs of the business as it's going to be in 5 years' time? And that was always our approach. Now, that people would say to you, the risk of doing that is the person's going to get bored and not feel challenged and leave because they haven't got enough challenges. I don't think there's a single case where someone left our business because they're bored. They left for all sorts of other reasons.
Right.
We were crazy, we're idiots or whatever.
Right.
But they never left because they were bored. And so I think that when you're hiring people, don't think, in a business, if you really have ambitious growth plans, don't think about, has this person got the capability to do today's job? Because otherwise you're going to be replacing them in 12 months. It's not going to be much fun for them or for you. Think about, has the person got the ability to do this job as I think it might look like in 4 or 5 years' time?
Yeah.
And that has been really important for us, and that's why most of our key guys, me excluded, I'm now off, having fun, but most of the key guys in the business have been with Seek for 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 years.
So Mitch, you have that. I mean, you're sort of going through the same thing that these guys are going through right now, except in 2 markets. I mean, you got Austin and you got here. So how do you manage that?
We've got a good leadership team in the US.
Yeah.
So Ed and I spend most of our time here.
Right.
We spend 8 weeks in the US a year, maybe 12.
Right.
But primarily managing through, so using video chat is something we do a lot, life size, but also lots of trips. So us going there, but also bringing the team from the US over here and sending a lot of our engineers, product managers and designers from Sydney to Austin. 1, to be close to the team there, and 2, to be close to customers in the same market as well. But I guess a lot of what the guys have said is true for us as well, especially around hiring, where let's say we have, a product manager. In 2 or 3 years, we don't want them to be a product manager. We want them to be a director of product management or moving into some other sort of leadership role where they have PMs under them. So trying to find people that scale well beyond where we are now based on what they've done at previous companies.
So do you use Jira, and have you used
Yes,
Seek?
yes. Yeah.
Okay, and how about you? Do you use?
We don't use Seek anymore, which is
terrible.
Early days.
Terrible.
What's wrong with you?
Wrong type of folks come through. No, to be honest, we don't use Seek.
Right.
But my wife is starting to use BigCommerce, so how has that?
Very good.
For her business.
Nice.
Very good. So if you had to, so we got various sort of ranges of businesses out here. Everything from, one of the guys said, I guess they were 4 months old, was he, to several years old. So what do you? I mean, What are the, you know, all of you guys have built really successful businesses, and you're on your way to building an incredibly successful business. So that's all terrific. Now, if you had to say, all right, let's give it up today, right, and let's start a new business, what are the sort of 2 or 3 really key things that you would say we have to do this in order to have a successful business, that you can sort of you know, give that wisdom to the audience if you could? What are the 2 or 3 things that are really, really important in starting a business today?
Let me have a go at that. I mean, let me answer it a slightly different way. Startups are really hard, and there's a good reason why most fail rather than succeed. And if you're a founder, you just have to absolutely believe that you're going to succeed. So as an investor, you probably approach the things slightly differently, a
Sure.
little bit more objectively. But I think as a founder, you just have to be just have that drive and that passion and energy, and kind of be prepared to overcome a whole lot of hurdles. But I think, you know, the way I think about building a successful startup, and the reason why it's hard, is because I think you need, you know, the right group of people with the right product at the right time, with a fair bit of luck thrown in. And if you combine all of those elements, that's why, you know, only a certain number of them succeed. But I think that's the way you need to think about it.
Yeah.
It starts with the people. You have to have a product or a service that actually meets a real need. It's not a solution in search of a problem. It's actually solving a real identifiable problem. Your timing needs to be right. We've seen plenty of people too early, too late. So you need to nail the timing. And you need to be lucky. And all of those elements are what's needed to have a successful startup.
Yeah.
Just on that topic, I'd say, just on the product, don't build a feature, build a product.
Yeah.
The idea that if you're building something that bolts onto Twitter or Facebook or BigCommerce or Jira, it's not a product.
Right.
It's a feature or a plugin.
Yep.
And it's going to be hard to build a sustainable business around that.
Yeah.
So build something that solves a need, but build it, productize it. Don't just whip something up and think that's a business.
Yeah, I would say have a co-founder. As
Yeah.
all 3 of us have co-founders.
Yeah.
Either 1 or 2. And almost all the businesses I've invested in have co-founders.
Yeah.
Actually, I was just thinking through it in my head, and your chances of success grow up dramatically. But not only that, your enjoyment of the journey and someone to share the terrible times is a big difference. So that's something I'd strongly encourage you to do. A lot of soul guys. And then I guess to echo what Mitch said in a reversed way is build something big that makes a difference.
Yeah.
Right? I meet so many guys, and they're just, if you're building it to sell it because you want to make $3 million, just go to something else. A, and B, if you're building something small, like, I don't know why, it's so much pain. It's so much pain to go through to build something small.
Yeah,
I don't get that. And people, I think in Australia, we don't dream to aim big enough. Like, you know, I keep pushing startups. I'm like, how do you make this into a $100 million business? And they're like, well, I think, you know, potentially Google could buy it with $100 million because we're doing. No. I don't mean buy it for $100 million. I mean, how do you take this past $100 million in revenue? And they're like, oh, you know, and they kind of have this cockamamie answer of 4 different generations of potential if all this. It's just not there, right? And it's kind of the sort of building a bolt-on or an add-on or whatever, right? If you look at the really successful tech businesses, if you want to take a kind of a slide rule of success, the people that, you know, the big companies that get out there, the ones that go public or get acquired for lots of money, you know, they're changing something fundamental in a big market and actually going large at it, right? And the second corollary to that, I guess, is too many people I see nowadays are building businesses that have a website, right? And you don't have a technology company if you're doing that. It's BS, right? In the late 90s, maybe you could argue that any business that had a storefront or some e-commerce angle or a CMS bolted on top, or it was built on top of WordPress, which wasn't around, but, you know, was a technology business. But nowadays you see all these startups and you're like, that's not really a fundable company at all. And in fact, it's not even a technology business.
Right.
It just happens to have a website. That just makes it a business nowadays, right? And so it needs to be, what is the core technology that you're building, and how big can you actually make it, right?
Sure.
We need to aim a lot bigger in this country.
Yeah, well, I would point out to you that, Seek, I think, $550 million in revenues, $200 million EBITDA. I think that's pretty substantial business, so that's awesome. So one final question, then I want to sort of throw it out. Rachel, do we have any time for questions from the audience at all? Or? No, okay. So I won't throw it out. So now you made me forget my question, for God's sake. Okay.
Got to make the last one a good one, Bill.
Okay. So if you had to start another business again, what areas do you sort of like these days?
I like travel and fitness,
Yeah.
using technology.
So Rome to Rio sounds
Travel
good.
and you mean running around? Or?
No,
I prefer travel to fitness. I'm much better at travelling than fitness. But
technology-enabled travel businesses and technology-enabled fitness businesses, like Runkeeper, Fitbit, those kinds of things. No ideas, but
How about you, Paul?
Oh, this is gonna-
You've had some more time to think
yeah,
about this.
I have. I have a lot more time than these guys. Look, this answer is going to sound really lame. I'm not a big believer in kind of spaces and markets. I prefer looking at individual businesses and saying, are they solving a real problem? What is the pain point here? What is it they're doing better than the incumbent? Because you're not going to create a new market, or you're not going to move dollars from point A to point B, or even more. You're not going to create a market that didn't exist before unless you're doing something quite different, quite special. And I'll give you a sort of a Seek analogy. I mean, we saw so many people in the 13 or 14 years that I was there who are kind of sort of competing with us in one form or another. And if someone came along 6 or 7 or 8 years after us with the same business model, kind of basically doing the same thing, except they were starting 6 or 7 years later, they had a lot less money, they had a lot less resources, we'd basically ignore it. If someone came along and was doing something really different and innovative and thinking about the problem differently, now, a lot of cases they may or may not have been thinking about it the right way, but if they were thinking about that problem differently, suddenly we took notice and thought, we've got to watch these guys, we've got to really focus, we're going to do a lot of work on them. So there's no point coming along and saying, you know what, these people have created a fantastic business and it's $1 billion marketplace and I'm going to take 5% of that by copying them. It just doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
What is your point of difference, and are you operating in a marketplace where there is actually a real value proposition for consumers, for businesses, a marketplace that you bring people together, whatever it happens to be. And also, what are the industry dynamics? Are they kind of favourable and it's kind of going like this? Or is it like the print industry where, reality is it's going like this and it's pretty hard to make money in that sort of a space? So that's the way I think about businesses rather than segments.
Yeah. How about you, Mike? What would you do?
Look, the enterprise space is a great one, to be honest. There's always going to be enterprises that are always going to pay money for more efficient ways of doing things, right?
Yeah.
And they're slow moving and they're willing to pay money. So I like anything in the enterprise space. I think there's a lot of interesting commerce angles going around at the moment.
Yep.
We're heavily conflicted and biased towards shoes of prey, but mass customization and new models of commerce, not just you guys are enabling people to put up shops, right? But just the generic shops and stuff is kind of done. I think mobile is going to be the biggest wave we've ever seen.
Yeah.
And it's probably going to make the least amount of new businesses we've ever seen. Because mobile in itself is not a business, right? Like, apart from Instagram, there's very few apps that have sold for any money.
Yeah.
Right? Because they just don't make any money,
Yeah, yeah.
right? It's not a fundable business. It's almost like a bootstrapped sort of organisation. So, I'm a bit down on the kind of mobile social thing. It's a huge wave, no doubt, but we get to see real businesses be built on that. I forget where I read the post, but someone wrote a post on inefficiencies in marketing, and I thought it was a fascinating way to look at big businesses, which is a different angle, which is basically that if you look at what's happened, if you talk about waves, there's waves of mobile and big data and blah, 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 blah. But what there also are waves is marketing channels. Right?
Yeah.
So if you come to me and you say, how are you going to scale your business? I will ask that a lot. And how are you going to make it big? What's fascinating is if you look at, so when AdWords, SEO and SEM came along, there were certain businesses that were built purely on the back of that marketing channel, right? So take Yelp. Yelp was entirely built basically on SEO and SEM until it reached its own scale. And then that marketing channel actually kind of closed behind them, right? It actually kind of shut down behind them. Same, Facebook built Zynga and a whole bunch of other businesses, and then that marketing channel closed down behind them. Yeah. And because it gets to be efficient. People are paying, Yelp's willing to pay $2 for an ad because they can get $1.99. You can't get in there. So I would say, what is the market you're going into, the product, etc. But what is your marketing channel? Because you look at really big internet businesses, they've all been built or gotten their start on some sort of inefficient marketing channel that they've taken advantage of before anyone else realised it was around. I mean, it sounds like you paid 900 cents, $7,500 for millions of bucks with advertising, right? Basically. Yeah. And by the time someone realised Seek had a size that was self-perpetuating. Yeah. We've done the same thing, so it's just something to keep in mind. It's not necessarily an angle, but how are you going to grow this at hyper-growth or at super space is often taking advantage of inefficiencies in marketing channels that no one else.
So I'll make one final thing and then we'll wrap it up. So everybody's built a great business. They're all Australian. B2B, B2B to C, B2B. So somebody wrote not too long ago, don't ignore the enterprise. I think that's truth, and you're seeing it right here.
Yep.
So congratulations, guys.